All right, Larry Krueger here from the Pig and a Pickle Krug Show across the street from Levi's, recapping all that happened today, Thursday, down here in Santa Clara. And of course, check out Pig and a Pickle, the best barbecue in all of Northern California. They're open 7 days a week from 11 a.m. till 8 p.m. or until they run out. Pig and a Pickle, the best barbecue in all of Northern California. Go get the brisket chili. Go say hi to Damon and Mary. Tell them that Larry Krueger sent you. We're also brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Check the link in the description. Use that promo code Krug, and they will match you up to your first $100. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we gleaned from Thursday down in 49er land. One, we went to practice. It was kind of a rainy practice. Chris Kasarik is yelling and screaming and trying like crazy to get his defensive linemen ready for, going to the Super Bowl and playing the Chiefs on Super Bowl Sunday. We talked to Fred Warner, though, first. And, he said, we've been so close and, we've got to sell out and make the most of this opportunity. And then he admitted that, the defense against Green Bay and against Detroit wasn't nearly good enough. And he said, you know what? It shows on film. The Chiefs are going to see it. He said, we have an opportunity to kind of right that ship. He was asked about the run defense, which the Niners have given up 5.6 yards per carry in the playoffs. He said, it's not giving great effort as a group, which is his explanation to it. He says, we've got to get back to our standard. And I asked him, what did you take away? And he said, well, we've got to play a full 60 minutes. I said, what did your takeaway from your experience against KC the first time around? And he admitted, he's like, that game scarred me for life. I thought we had it. We didn't have it. I learned that we got to play the full 60 minutes against a guy like Mahomes, against a coach like Andy Reid. So I thought that was really interesting. He mentioned that it was two completely different teams. He was asked about Travis Kelce. He says, man, Mahomes and Kelce just have a great bond. Mahomes knows where Kelce's going to be, and that really helps. It's funny. He was asked about the stat sheet in the first half against the Lions, and what he thought when he looked at the stat sheet. And he says, I didn't want to look at the stat sheet at halftime against Detroit. I knew that it was bad. And then I asked him, I said, when you get guys out there that maybe aren't playing particularly hard or hard enough or to your standard, to your level of passion. I mentioned that him and Greenlaw play to a real high level. He said, I try to set the standard by how I play. I don't necessarily hold guys verbally accountable as much as I try to play to a standard and make people play to my standard by the way I play, which was interesting. He was asked about Trent Williams having multiple lockers, and he called it Trent's little mall. He says he can do whatever he wants, which is how I feel as well. It's like, hey, man, he's going to Canton. If the guy wants to have two lockers, let him have two lockers. He was asked about Mooney Ward. He said it's great to have a guy who's got Super Bowl championship experience. He was asked about the key to defending Patrick Mahomes, and he said keep him in the pocket. He mentioned that guys really started to play hard in the second half against Detroit, and it's like he basically just kind of admitted that the first half was not a great first half. Then Nick Bosa took to the podium. We got a chance to talk to Bosa, and he was asked about last time he played in the Super Bowl, and he was a young guy. He was a rookie. It was February of 2020, and he says, you learn a lot. He says, you learn. He said, I learned that you got to play all four quarters. There's a different level intensity that's required to win in the playoffs against teams like Kansas City, against quarterbacks like Mahomes. And he was asked if he was held on that 3rd and 14 pass against Kansas City, and he said yes. He was asked by one of the media guys if this year's defense playing at the same level as the 2019 defense was playing, and he said yeah, but not as consistently. Like they're not as consistently playing at that level. He was asked about Isaiah Pacheco, and he said, man, he really runs hard. I asked him, I said, who in your D-line room holds guys accountable for how hard they play? Because it just didn't look like Givens or Chase Young were playing particularly hard at times in the second quarter against Detroit. And he said Chris, and then Daryl Tapp, and then he mentioned Eric Armstead, and then he said himself. He said, though, the four of us create a standard that everybody's got to play to. He was asked about defending Mahomes. What's the key to defending Mahomes? He said, man, you got to keep Mahomes in the pocket. He thinks that's the key. And he said that Kyle feels like the Niners D-line stamina is the key to this game. And I agree. They're going to have to really play hard for all four quarters. If they do, they got enough talent to bother Mahomes and to win this game. But that's going to be the key right there. Does the D-line have the stamina to play all four quarters against Pacheco and Mahomes and really, have their presence felt? I think that was spot on by Shanahan, and Bosa mentioned that. He also mentioned that Andy Reid's a great game planner. He talked about Mooney Ward. He called him a valuable piece as a Super Bowl winner with that experience. Looking ahead to the Super Bowl against Kansas City, he said it's going to be an intense day. And I asked him specifically about Donovan Smith and Jawan Taylor, and I mentioned how Taylor's got 20 penalties and leads the NFL. I said, what stands out to you when you watch the film of Kansas City's offensive tackles? And without even, thinking about it, he's like, they hold a lot. So that's going to be a theme going into this next game is, can Kansas City block Bosa without holding him? And I'm sure the Niners are going to let it be known that, Kansas City's tackles hold all the time. And in the 22 game, he talked about how Kansas City cut him a lot, chipped him a lot, and in this game, he's going to be ready for all the different tricks that Andy Reid has up his sleeve to try to block Nick Bosa. Then Kyle Shanahan, we talked to Kyle Shanahan. He said that Ambry Thomas has an ankle injury. He was limited in practice today. That George Kittle's got a toe injury and would not practice today, and he wasn't out there. And then he mentioned that Oren Burks has got a shoulder injury and that he's limited. So the Niners overall are pretty healthy. When he was asked further about George Kittle's toe, is it a turf toe injury? He just wouldn't expand on it. He just said it's a toe. So, he said, what did he learn he was asked about what he learned from the last Super Bowl against Kansas City, and said, it's about what happens in those 3 hours. That he thinks that having experience playing in this game definitely helps. He mentioned how Mooney Ward's game has really grown. He can do a lot more things now than he could do when they first got him. He mentioned how Patrick Mahomes is as hard to beat as anyone in the history of the game, and that the Niners, of course, have never beaten Mahomes, and they're still trying to figure out exactly how to do it. He said Andy Reid's a great head coach. They've got a great staff. He also talked. I asked him about the lack of effort by Chase Young and Kevin Givens and some of the defenders on that Jahmyr Gibbs touchdown run that made it 21-7 in the second quarter. And, he basically said, I said, is this your culture? And he said, it looked bad. And he said, it's not our culture. And he went on to say, he says, we don't want to have, even one play like that. And we had some backside guys that weren't going. And he just acknowledged, I'll say this, he didn't dodge it. He didn't try to say, oh, no, our guys were playing really hard. He's like, man, we had some backside guys that weren't going, and it looked really bad. And obviously that has to change. He said there's a few bad clips in the game. It looked really bad. And he just kind of admitted it and owned it. He was asked about the COVID year, a few years ago, and he said the hardest thing that year was that they had no off season to kind of go over the Super Bowl and try to learn from it. That they first went over the Super Bowl with the players in training camp the next year because of all the time away due to COVID. He was asked about whether or not he was on the hot seat, and he said, man, as a coach, you're always on the hot seat. And, as far as Pacheco, he said, man, he consistently runs really, really hard. He said, we need our run game to really be on offensively to win this game. He said he was really glad to have 2 weeks to prepare for Kansas City and not one. There were a couple of years in there when Lynch and the Buccaneers played the Raiders in the Super Bowl. That was a 1-year break between the conference title game and the Super Bowl. He said, he's glad that he's got the 2 weeks. And he said he'll have the game plan completely installed this week before they leave for Vegas. I think they probably already have the game planning completely installed, but next week they'll tinker with it and they'll make any changes they need to make. And then we actually talked to Jed York today for the first time in a long, long time. And Jed just said, he's ready to get this thing done. And that means win the Super Bowl, not just make it. He mentioned how his son's playing flag football and was ready to cry at halftime of the Lions game. He was asked what it feels like to be back in the Super Bowl, and he said the worst feeling in the world is losing the NFC title game. So he's really happy to be back. He thinks the Niners are more mature overall this time around, and that they'll handle the bright lights better this time around than they did last time. He says he believes in in his guys and that we'll be ready. He was asked, what's your lasting memory from the last Super Bowl? And he's like, Nick Bosa being held on the 3rd and 14. That came to mind. He admitted that he gets really tense during games and that it's really hard for him to watch some of these games. He was asked about, is the Niners window closing? And he says, that's a BS concept in this league. He says, you just never know. I kind of agree with that. He was asked about when he interviewed Kyle, what he thought of Kyle. And he said in the first 5 minutes that Kyle said to him, hey man, this is one of the worst rosters in the entire league. So Kyle was very straight with him, very honest. He's like, Kyle shoots you straight. I asked him about how he's really stayed in the background a lot in the last year. And he says, I really don't need to speak. When you hear from me, it's generally not good. We've got 2 great leaders of the organization. Obviously, he's referring to John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan. He was asked about who's going to the Super Bowl from the Niners, and he said the entire staff, all the interns, the entire staff they'll send multiple charters, and everybody's going to the Super Bowl. He was asked about, Mayoko asked him, well, if Kyle wins versus loses, does that change his status? And he says, I love Kyle, win or lose, and I think he's a phenomenal coach. I think Kyle's results more than speak for themselves. So Kyle's going to be here whether he wins this game or not. Then I thought the most interesting part of the entire Jed sit-down was what he said next. He said in training camp in 2022, when they had Jimmy Garoppolo and they're paying him $20 million, and they had Trey Lance and they had traded all these draft picks for him, that Kyle pulled him aside and said, man, we need to talk. And Kyle told him, I think our best quarterback is our 3rd string quarterback. Kyle thought back in 2022, and I said it at the time, that I felt like, Purdy had a real future and looked really, really good. And that's what Jed says he loves about Kyle. He says, it's a hard thing to hear. You're paying one guy $20 million. You invested all this draft capital in the other guy, and yet the third guy, in Kyle's mind, is their best quarterback. But he said he's always honest, and he let it play out the right way. He said Kyle's open and honest and will always shoot you straight. So I thought that was interesting. I thought the other thing that was interesting, he was asked about the CMC trade. He said that Kyle thought the price tag was too high, but that John and Jed thought the price tag was right. And ultimately it was like, hey, man, do you want to see McCaffrey with the Rams? And they kind of, thought it over and said, no, we really don't want to see him with the Rams. Then he was asked about Brock Purdy, and he mentioned how he met Purdy's family, and he said, they're really nice people and that they're so intense on every detail. And he said Brock's a wonderful young man. He works really hard. And, him and his family are really, intense as far as wanting to see him do well. He mentioned how Sean Purdy, Brock's dad, pitched at University of Miami and beat John Lynch in Stanford. And Stanford, of course, was a baseball power, as is Miami. And then mentioned how Purdy mentioned that to Lynch at some point. And then he also just kind of mentioned that, his dad kind of reminds him of Brock, and that Brock's got this air of confidence around him. And then before Jed walked off, I asked him, is Eddie D going to be in Vegas? And he said, I'm not sure. He says, man, he gets really worked up, more so even than I do. And he's not sure if he'll be in Vegas. I have a feeling Eddie's going to be there. And then he also was asked about the trade that brought Chase Young to the Niners mid-season. And he's like, a lot of people would look at that and say a third-round pick for a guy who's a free agent at the end of the year is not a good trade. But we're trying to win a Super Bowl, and we're all in on getting it done. So very interesting. But probably the most interesting thing was the fact that Kyle told Jed in training camp of 2022, well before Trey Lance, had kind of run its course. Well, while they still had Jimmy, they still had Lance, that Kyle told Jed that Purdy was their best quarterback. And that makes me feel actually really good about Kyle because, man, I'm sitting there, and I think I know a little bit about personnel myself, and I'm sitting there watching that, and I felt the exact same way. I mean, you got a $20 million quarterback who's working off on the side. You got a quarterback that you invested all these picks in, but his ball is high and low and fluttering and in and out and up and down. And then you got this third string guy who just looked like he was mastering every drill, and he looked great. And it just makes me feel good about Kyle, the fact that he lets his eyes tell his brain what he sees. He doesn't let his brain kind of color everything and just be like, well, no, Jimmy's 20 million. Trey's invested in all these picks. They're better. No, he didn't think so. He thought Brock was better. And to me, that makes me feel good about Kyle's football personnel evaluation skills. All right, that does it from 49er Land here on a Thursday. Thanks to Pig and a Pickle for being the title sponsor of the Krug Show. Thanks to Underdog Fantasy for sponsoring the video. Thanks to all you guys for supporting the Krug Show on YouTube.